outside the door. If I see him, if he comes in, all you gotta do is just raise your hand and I actually go ahead and drop his presentation.
Just running. Do you want to start or should I? Okay. Okay. Stand over here. Wow. Do you need the mic?
Good morning, everybody. I think we'll get this started. It's 10 o'clock. We have 5 speakers, so we got a packed session. My name is Andrew Eskerson. I work at the Institute for Applied Ecology. I'll be the moderator for this session. So this is the seed-based restoration. Okay, thank you. So just a couple quick housekeeping things for the presenters. We have 20-minute blocks for you, hopefully about 15 minutes for your presentations, 5 minutes for questions. I'll be sitting right there. I have 2 signs. They're really big, but probably annoying when I'm holding them up. One's yellow, it says 3 minutes, and one's red, it says 1 minute. So I'll try to do my best and not cut you off, but we have a lot of speakers. So we want to keep things moving and give everyone the opportunity to speak. If you have cell phones, if you could put them on silent, that would be great. So if they're not going off by speakers, that would be wonderful. And then if we have all our speakers, but if somebody doesn't show up, we're actually not going to have a presentation until their time's allotted because people are coming into the room. I don't think that'll be the case for this session. So with that, I think we'll get going. Our first speaker is Turk from the Institute for Applied Ecology, and she'll be talking about investigating alternative seed mixes and resources for roadside revegetation in New Mexico.
Thanks. Okay. Yeah, I'm Turk with the Southwest Office of the Institute for Applied Ecology. It's really awesome to see you all here, so thanks for coming. Standing room only. So the overarching problem that we were addressing with this study was dust generation, which is a major cause of motorist fatalities in the Southwest in particular, and even more in particular in the area where we did our study near Lordsburg, New Mexico, here in the southwestern part of the state of New Mexico. We have the Interstate I-10 running through, and in this area, there have been 120 dust events since 2012, and they have resulted in 21 deaths. So in response to this, the Federal Highway Administration granted money to the New Mexico Department of Transportation to address this dust, reduce windborne dust, and that included funding for this study that I'm going to talk about. So one major way that we could generate dust along roadways is through construction or maintenance. So the New Mexico Department of Transportation already has revegetation as a standard practice after construction or maintenance, and that includes seeding and then application of tackifiers or mulch like you see here. And when they do seeding, they have a standard list of species, which are all purchased commercially sourced seed that they use. So our question was whether we could improve roadside revegetation success in New Mexico by improving the seed mixes that the Department of Transportation uses. And there are 2 different parts to this question that we were investigating. So first, whether we could use more local plant materials, so seeds that are locally collected and more adapted to the areas that we were putting them. And then also including species that aren't already commonly used by the Department of Transportation and that have desired traits. So particularly dust mitigation properties through their growth form, soil stabilization, maybe through their root growth, and then establishment ability in these really tough conditions that they face in the Lordsburg area. So this was a 4-year study, and we started off with a literature review, and 95 species were evaluated with a rubric that assigned scores related to those properties that I just talked about, desired traits. And from this literature review, we chose 8 finalist species to target for a seed collection effort. And this was necessary to actually provide the plant materials, the local plant materials, to compare to the commercial mix. And I'll be focusing on the field experiment side of things from here on out. So, again, our study was located near Lordsburg, New Mexico, on the Lordsburg Playa. We had 5 different sites. 2 of them were on the right-of-way of I-10 here, and then 3 of them were closer to the playa, which is this big dry lake bed that you see here, and were on private or state land. They were chosen because they all had similar challenging soils, so alkaline, sodic, highly erodible, really challenging in general for revegetation and restoration. And this is an example of one of our sites and the soil conditions there. So the treatments for our study were the different seed mixes, and we were comparing the standard Department of Transportation species commonly used here and commercially sourced like they would be for a typical revegetation effort to locally collected seed of the same forest standard species, and then also for alternate species that aren't commonly used by the Department of Transportation but possess some of those traits that were desirable that we also already talked about. And yeah, the functional groups are listed there. So for installation, this study went in 2020. What was really important to the Department of Transportation is that it was at a scale that was relevant to be directly applied to their management practices. So the blocks were relatively large, or sites. We had 1 acre seeded at each site. And the process for seeding started with scarification of the soil. That's what you see here. We had basically like a little rake scraping up the soil. Then we hydro-seeded with our seeds, crimped, which is just rolling the seeds into the soil for good seed-soil contact, and then a hydromulch treatment and tackifier applied on top. And also following the New Mexico Department of Transportation standards, the seeding rate was 10.28 pounds per acre. Okay, digging into the methods a little bit more for data collection. If this is our site, one large 1 acre site, we had 1/16 of an acre plots at each site, and within each plot we had 8 randomly placed quadrats where we collected our data. And the data collected included vegetation cover of all species and target species counts to get at the idea of how successful our seeding was. We also did size and reproduction of the target species, and then soil aggregate stability to kind of get at the question of how we're affecting the erodibility of the soils through these treatments. We also did repeat photo points, which is what you see here. So these show our the same plot at our 3 different monitoring times. So we did a baseline monitoring in 2019, the study went in 2020, and then we had post-implementation monitoring in 2021 and 2022. Oh, it's not working anymore. Maybe I can. Oh, it opened like the Windows thing. Maybe if we close that, it'll work.
It's advancing on the computer, not up there.
Let's see. I mean, I could try to give it just from memory, but that'll be really tough.
Advancing on the computer side.
It never was advancing on there during the rest of it. At least you have some nice photos to look at. Think about the plants that grew. Oh!
Sure, no.
Do I need to point it somewhere? Okay. We're back. Okay, so this would have been really hard to explain without this graph. This is the final piece of background information I'll give you because it's really important to frame the rest of what we'll be talking about. So this is a graph from the US Drought Monitor, in Hidalgo County, where Lordsburg is located, and the y-axis is just percent area of the county, and that was in these different stages of drought. So yellow is just abnormally dry, and as we get darker, it's increased levels of drought conditions, so this maroon, dark maroon color is exceptional drought. Then we have our study milestones at the top here. So we installed in June, July of 2020, and that's right when the drought kicked off. And then we had 9 months of exceptional drought following the seeding, and it really was dry the entire time, but we did get some rain in 2022. All right, jumping into the results, looking at vegetation cover. So we looked at both target species cover, so the things that we seeded, and total vegetation cover. For target species cover, the average across all plots was 0.43%, so not a ton of target species cover. For total plant cover, we saw significant differences by site, so that's what you see here. On the y-axis we have total plant cover, and on the x we have our 5 different sites, and just really variable vegetation cover even with the similar soil conditions 2 years post-implementation. And there were no significant differences in cover by either total or target species cover by the seed source. When we look at the target species counts, we can sort of see some more trends and things happening than when we look at the cover. So first, looking at numbers in 2021 compared to 2022, we do see more recruitment in 2022. Got a little bit of rain. We saw that there was maybe some dormancy breaking, so that's good. If we look at individual species that did well during these conditions, Baillia multiradiata, a perennial forb, comes out as a species that did relatively well, definitely the most successful perennial species that we seeded. When we look at these shrub species, there's a little more nuance because we had the opportunity in areas of the site that weren't otherwise used to do some kind of more observational experimental things and did a really heavily seeded, high seeding rate hand seeding treatment. And what we saw, this is a little cut off, but while they didn't do particularly well at the 10.28, maybe Atriplex obovata did, which was locally collected, and a new species slightly better. In these hand-seeded plots, there was much more recruitment. So this says 102 or something like that, and this says 120 or 150. I can't really remember, but orders of magnitude higher than what we saw in the original plots. And then lastly, we have Bouteloua aristodoides. This is an annual grass species, which did particularly well. We can't attribute this all to our seeding treatment because it was also a common volunteer where it wasn't seeded. But that leads us to one of our most interesting observations, which is that all the volunteers that had really high cover were annual grasses. Or the ones that had the most, not all of them, but. And to drive this home, we have this graph which shows the proportion of total plant cover on the y-axis at our 5 different sites again on the y. And this sort of yellowish color is annual grass. So the majority of sites had mostly annual grass after these 2 years. And finally, looking at soil aggregate stability, there were no significant differences in the soil stability by the source again, which is to be expected considering our target species didn't make up a lot of cover. We did notice that plots with higher vegetation cover in 2022 also tended to have higher soil stability in 2022. So even though it wasn't what we planted, the vegetation cover seemed to be providing some soil stability. And then just a more observation again is that despite the level of disturbance that we applied during installation with these scarification treatments that totally ripped up the soil, we didn't see soil stability decrease as much as you might expect and saw relatively quick recovery. And we attribute that to the hydromulch treatments that were applied. And then I just had to add this because I'm a biological soil crest fan. We did see recovery of crust, after 2 years at one of the sites, which is pretty crazy, unheard of, awesome. Okay, last observational thing we did see. Here we have our plots. You can't really see, but our transect tape is lined out there. And then this is the buffer area where the machinery actually drove in and conducted the seeding. So the machinery left some small depressions within each plot, and what we see is that in between, in the buffer areas of each plot, you have tons of recruitment and cover. And you can sort of see it up close here where there's evidence of water that had pooled there. Okay, so this figure is from this paper called Weather-Centric Rangeland Revegetation Planning. Oh, it's a really great paper, I suggest you read it. And essentially, what I wanted to gain from this figure is that even in these really, really harsh conditions that we faced for this study, we did see some successful treatments. So let's say the annual grasses did well. So since they did well in a poor weather year, that would be something that would be a good candidate for adopting for management. Basically, the insights that we get from these things that do well in these really harsh conditions are really informative, considering that, like Tom was talking about, we're going to face higher temperatures and more unpredictable precipitation into the future. So back to our question, can we improve roadside revegetation and success by improving seed mixes? We did see in our field research that there were some species that were capable of establishment despite the really harsh conditions. In terms of perennial species, that was Bailea multiradiata. Annual grasses had highest establishment overall, and the seeding did increase their cover slightly, so continuing to do those. And then for the things that didn't work, we really just need reevaluation. So particularly of these commercial versus local sources, since we do have research that shows that more native local plant materials do better for successful revegetation. That would be something to revisit. And then just looking at these other trends and observations, like we saw in the buffer zones, if we have restoration techniques that create depressions and increase seed and water retention, they seem really promising for this area. This is actually also done by the Department of Transportation in the same area. We saw that hydromulch was a promising treatment, and also that increasing seeding rates for shrubs and probably all the different species that we seeded would be a really good recommendation for. Okay, so that's all I have. My email's here if you need to contact me with questions. This took a lot of help, so thanks for listening.
We have time for a couple questions. If anybody has questions?
How many species were in the mix?
There were 4 species, and I did 4 species in each mix, and they actually were applied both as a monoseed. Oh, I have too many animations to be going back through, but they were applied individually and as the 4 species mix.
And is the low number because of the study, or is that because your Department of Transportation, are their mixes low in species?
That was mostly study logistics, especially since we were doing monoseeded plots and there were these huge plots. Increasing the plot numbers would have been really time restrictive and space restrictive, I guess. I want to go back to that. I saw somebody else's hand, I thought.
Yeah. What was your seeding rate? I don't know if I missed that.
The seeding rate was 10.28 pounds per acre for this main part of the study.
Whatever it was, just one species or the mix.
Yeah, exactly. So the mix was the same, so there was less of each species when it was applied as a mix.
Okay, so for the successful species, what would be the recommendation, the recommended seed rate?
So we're doing, sorry, I don't know if you guys can hear the question, but she also asked what would be the recommended seeding rate, which is a great question. I think we just did proposals for sort of similar revegetation work around the state, and we suggested doubling that, so doing at least 20 pounds per acre for those.
Yeah, could you talk a little bit more about how you had originally 95 species and then you narrowed down that list? What was that process?
I can try. I was not part of that effort, and I wish I had the nice rubric they had, but basically they had all these species that were either on the DOT list already or just were in the area, and then did really good digging into the literature. And the rubric was like those 5 different things I talked about at least. So dust mitigation, soil stabilization, ability to establish in drought, and basically there was like a score 1 to 5 for each of those categories. And then based on literature review, those species were assigned scores, and then the ones that came to the top were what were mostly chosen for seed collection.
Just to add one thing.
Yeah.
It was really important that part of the study helped to make those materials commercially available, and so the ease of collection, the ease of production was another
Right.
variable that was considered.
Yeah, it was really important that populations are big enough to collect, not even just for this study, but for commercial availability as well. Yes, Melanie was a big part of this study, so she's my co-author.
Okay, we're out of time for questions for Tyler, but if you have questions, there she is. Her email's there. Please find her after this talk and ask her lots of questions. Thank you, Tyler.
Hello,
Yes,
can
ma'am.
you hear me? Thank you.
All right. Thanks, everyone. Our next presenter is Cathy from the Idaho Transportation Department. She'll be talking about tri-state perspective on seed-based restoration.
Thank you. So I'm here to represent DOTs in the Northwest, and this presentation is a compilation of what we're doing in the Washington State, Oregon State, and Idaho. So just to start off with that. Oop. Okay. As a lot of you know, that there's a lot of challenges with native seed plantings. I won't have to go through a whole lot of it. But in the Northwest, we're faced with a lot of different things, from wildfires that are taking and damaging hundreds of thousands of acres. We have floods and droughts in other parts of the United States, and a growing list of other hazards that are directly affecting millions of acres of native plant communities in the US. After these extreme events, trying to restore our damaged landscapes often includes planting large quantities of native seed species, specifically some regionally specific seeds, that assist in the reestablishment of native plant communities and help stabilize the soils and provide a foundation for resilient native ecosystems. You know that the supply for these types of projects, large-scale projects, and the diversity of the native plant species that we need to have or would like to have is insufficient to meet that need. In the Western United States, the volatility of demand influenced by severity of the wildfires and large-scale events year to year creates an uncertain market for the seed industry. And on top of that, our road systems have disturbances from these fires, as well as from construction going on, routine maintenance, and those leave behind highly altered soils. So we're dealing with a lot of other variables on our road systems. So some of the unique challenges for our DOT, we have millions of acres of unpaved land or right-of-ways within our road systems. They're both state and federal highways and the right-of-ways. These areas have the potential and could benefit for different measures with proactive measures to secure and improve production of native seed. These also can be vulnerable due to delay in supporting native seed production. So we have some challenges and some advantages or disadvantages depending on the timing of how we can partner with folks. These areas can be valued landscapes as we've been directed by our federal counterparts or federal highways and other federal agencies for habitats for pollinators, animal species. They can benefit a lot of different things utilizing road systems to connect fragmented habitat systems. And again, the high seed demands for restoration projects often limits us as a DOT and what we would have available at the time that we need to have these projects going. And then again, as a lot of you know, there's inconsistency with the timing of getting that seed mix or the seed species that you want at the right times. However, there are some successes that have been happening throughout the United States. One of the big programs that the DOTs have in their favor right now has been the Operation Wildflower program, which was initiated and started in the 1980s. This allows the use of wildflowers and native plants within the DOT systems. And then we have one of the longest roadside programs that began in the 80s as well, showcasing the Iowa Tallgrass Prairie Center that partnered with Iowa DOT to collect native seed on the state's remaining stands of tallgrass prairie on the rural roadsides. Today, native seeds are utilized on various roadside projects, restoration projects across the US, and available to farmers and other landowners that we work with who participate in these programs. So just to kind of give you an idea of the Northwest area, we're constantly trying to design and construct and maintain sustainable highway systems. And doing that, we have to think about where we've come from, where we want to go, and how do we get there. To give you a perspective from a DOT, there's 3 different distinct management strategies that we look at. One is the industrial strategy, which includes pavement and structures and other hard surfaces. That's your road system itself. And then agronomic strategy, which is our routine maintenance actions such as mowing activities, herbicide applications, predictable maintenance costs and budgets. These areas are usually beyond the pavement. And so beyond the pavement area, beyond the shoulder area and on, and then we have an ecological strategy. So this is incorporating integrated vegetation management. These are precise selective treatments, properly, timed treatments. These are multi-year, multi-scale projects and really lined out and planned. This would be areas like in the number 3 area over here. So, and then these are just showing you the differences. We have the pavement area in the shoulder, then we have the operational zone in zone 2, and then 3 is what we consider a buffer zone or an area that we have the most flexibility in the types of plants that we plant. And some of our challenges that we face is trying to keep our road system safe for travelers. That includes having an area or a zone, which we call the safety zone, that's low-growing species, typically grasses, for runoffs, for vehicle accidents, etc. We also have challenges with fires on our road systems and trying to maintain our road systems that reduce the fire starts and spread. We also have challenges now coming in with pollinators and the decline of pollinators and habitats. So we have a lot of different tasks and directives asking for us. And this is also including managing noxious weeds and invasive species along with everything. This is a slide that just kind of gives you some ideas of what we have as road systems within our 3 states. Washington DOT is made up, the state is made up of 6 different districts or regions. And within that, they are managing their road systems all in their state for $20 million on an annual basis. That's including their maintenance, their product or materials that they need. Oregon DOT has 14 different districts within their state or regions, and they are spending about $15 million annually just to maintain their road systems. And we in Idaho Transportation Department, we're roughly spending about $10 million, and that's not including any kind of increases in our budgets every year. This is kind of like what it's been over the last 10 to 20 years. So with not an increase in budget to maintain road systems, not enough budget to really look at doing a lot of native plants, but we are doing what we can. This is just giving you some ideas. For vegetative shoulders, we're looking at a total between our 3 states of 44,000 miles, which equates to roughly about 250,000 acres of right-of-way vegetated right-of-way areas. And if you look at that and think about that in terms of football fields, that's over 195,000 football fields laid end to end. And this is just maps of our road systems. We have a tri-state seed zone maps and ecoregions. This is just giving you an idea of all the different kinds of seed zones that we have within our states and some overlaps within the seed zones and the ecoregions. Within Idaho and Washington also, we develop seed mixes based on ecoregions. We look at what native plants typically grow in these ecoregions, and then we look at what plants and seed are available commercially, and then we take into account what's available cost effectively. So because of our low budgets, we don't have a lot of money to spend on large scale plantings of native plants everywhere, so we have to kind of tailor that. And within Idaho Transportation, we've actually developed native seeds lists for ecoregions. These are just 2 examples, one in the North Idaho area, one in the Southern Idaho area. And we list the different species of grasses, and then pollinator species, which includes forbs and shrubs. We have a list of what their blooming times are, and then you can build a plant mix based off of the lists. So these are some of the considerations we take into account when we look at building seed mixes. Of course, you want to choose the right species for the location, so that includes soil type, precipitation, and precipitation, the elevation, sunlight, exposure, etc. We have to find the right species for the types of zones within our road system. So anything up close to the pavement out to about 10 or 20 feet are typically grasses, low-growing grasses, because of the safety zones for vehicles that leave the road system, for fires, trying to prevent that or reduce that. Anything beyond 20 feet, we can include forbs or shrubs, and especially looking at slopes, we need stabilization, so we typically use plants that have deeper root systems. These are just some of the pretty pictures. I gotta include pretty pictures of some of the native plants of our road systems. This is Idaho. These are successful systems according to the Oregon Transportation Department and Washington. Washington actually compared 2 different looks at their state within the west side of the state, west the Cascades and east. West Washington is off of I-15 near Lacey, And that was a about 5-mile stretch along there. And this is an example of a highway that has minimal maintenance because they've achieved their objective, which is to have some natives growing and less maintenance. And the eastern side is successful in the fact that it's gotten to where they want it to be, but not without a lot of work. Annual maintenance required in the eastern side of the state. For native roadside restoration, it's important to know what kinds of acres and road systems you have, locations for restoration projects. I'm gonna have to go fast on this. So knowing which ones are in disrepair or need help and intervention, building this case for this, and looking at partnership opportunities, as well as incorporating life cycle integrated vegetation management programs, and then documenting successful projects. Successful projects and data is what gives us dollars. So if we can build a case that says what we're doing is working and it's what we are trying to achieve with a native restoration, native seed and plants, we can ask for more dollars from our legislatures. So these are just some, I'm just going to throw in some of the national research that's being done with transportation systems, and we work in partnership with the Transportation Research Board, which is part of the Applied Sciences. We have research on all sorts of topics. Of course, the emerging topics are now pollinators and how to restore or enhance habitat for pollinators. We have roadside fire prevention and response. These are all important emerging things coming through the pipeline for us in the Northwest. And these are some of the research publications that have come to light. So our future needs, we're looking at interstate collaboration between the Northwest states, Idaho, Washington, Oregon, and we're looking at consistent right-of-way asset management between our partners, us as a group, and we're developing seed mix workhorse species between our 3 states, which species work and overlap within our states and are utilized. And then also looking at those little niches that we can find, that those specific plant species that work in different niches within our states. And of course, look, we're doing training. We're in partnership with the 3 of us, and we're having an annual meetings trying to work on this issues and focus on trying to make things better. And with that, I'm going to say thank you for coming to the session today, and I'm open for any questions. Yes.
I was curious about your seed procurement practices and whether you include any kinds of preferences or other, like bidding practices that could help support a regional native seed supply that would ensure that you have availability of those species that you need for those ecoregions.
That is one thing we need to work on better. When I first started, I had the advantage of purchasing seed for our state projects, where I had control over what we bid out, who I was able to award. And now since then it's returned to for Idaho, returned to our contractors that are awarded the bid for those projects, which are then able to work with any of the seed suppliers that they know and like best. And so some of the species aren't what we are looking for on our roadside mixes. They're natives, but maybe not the right natives from that area. If that makes sense. So yeah, we're looking at trying to see what we can do to get the avenues out there and get the word out as to who supplies seed quality, the right species for the right areas. And in Washington and Oregon, I believe it's probably the similar type thing. We don't have the control over who we can buy from. So.
Just wondering how low is low enough for right beside the road, and some of your species list,
height.
Blue bunch wheatgrass and stuff seems a bit high. I know that's probably mowed, but I'm just wondering in terms of
Blue bunch wheatgrass is a typical one we use right near the edge because it will be mowed.
Yeah.
We know that there's going to be that maintained annually area, but mowing is still, where mowing height is about 10 inches. So it gives some leeway with some of the bigger grasses. We don't try to plant like Great Basin wild rye right up on the road edge. We put those out towards the fence line area. So typically our mowing height is 10 inches, but for fire-prone areas, it can go down as low as 5 inches. And it'll be mowed or something in there to keep it low. Yes. Yes.
Do you require contractors to buy certified seed?
Yeah. Yes. We put on our list of seed species and the mix is certified. Doesn't necessarily mean that it's always that way. We do have the advantage to look at the seed tags when they come in. I do anyway, and see what kind of seed and what it is. But we don't typically have control over if they supply something else. We can ask them to go somewhere else and find it, which takes more time and takes them more cost. And sometimes it's kind of one of those scales.
One more question?
Yeah, maybe you've answered this already, but who's doing the work to develop those workhorse species that you mentioned in the last slide?
What was the question was?
Who's doing
the work?
those workhorse species?
Myself and then my counterparts from Washington DOT and Oregon. We're looking at what are the most common native species we use within our road systems, and is there a way we can get more, if we knew which one, let's say blue bunch wheatgrass, I know it grows in Oregon and Washington as well. That would be a workhorse species. So we're compiling a list of all those together right now and looking at other other native species that we can add to the mix for certain projects or certain specific areas or specialized areas. So, right, thank you.
Do a mic
Right.
test.
Test. Oh, got it. All right.
All right, our next presenter is Kelly Homan from Auburn University. She'll be talking about plant species corridors. Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you. So thank you for coming. It's a full room. So I'm a landscape architect. I mentioned that because I don't think we're very well represented here. I think I saw one other landscape architect. I'm also from Alabama. I also only saw one other person from Alabama. But essentially, I'm a designer. So my first degree is horticulture. So I'm kind of this mix of design and science. But today, I want to talk about some research I have. So this is ongoing research. It's not complete by any means. But what you're looking at here are G1 and G2 species in Alabama. So these are species that are endangered. They're ranked very high for possible extinction. And I want to talk for a minute about funding. So currently, we give most of our funding, conservation funding, to animals. And we really like, the more kind of flashy, fuzzy the animal is, the more funding it gets. And I'm not anti-animals, right? We do need to put money towards animals, but if we are gonna be interested in kind of diversity, biodiversity, we've gotta kind of start reallocating how we give funding. So within Alabama, in particular, many of the plant species that are endangered are found in grasslands. So I know there's other kind of people here that are interested in grasslands, but for Alabama, that includes prairies, savannas. In the northern part of the state, we've got some of the rockier grasslands, wet grasslands, and then the kind of coastal marshes. But to put this in perspective for you, 95% of our funding right now goes to animals and their habitats, and only 5% go to individual plant species. And what's interesting is we actually have a lot more plants in trouble than we do animals. So currently, and I've heard the initial speakers talk about this, we have a good bit of funding that's kind of coming down the pipeline for conservation work. This includes the America the Beautiful, the Infrastructure Act, Recovering America's Wildlife Act. So it's somewhat of an unprecedented kind of time where there's a lot that can be done. So again, I mentioned my work is in Alabama. And so what you're looking at here is a map in purple of all the protected land areas in the country, right? And what you see is this obvious kind of weight towards the west, right? There's not a lot of land that we have kind of things that we can do with in some type of protection in the east. In the southeast, Alabama actually has the lowest amount of protected land with, I think, 4%. A little bit more about Alabama. So we actually rank first east of the Mississippi in species diversity. First in freshwater, we're fourth in the country, but we also rank number 2 in extinctions, only behind Hawaii. So on the mainland, we're number 1, basically. Number 1 in football, right? Number 1 in species extinctions. So it's kind of a scary statistic. We also just recently, in 2017 or 18, Lower Alabama got designated as the 36th hotspot. So what you're looking at here, globally, hotspots, they make up about 4, something like that, % of land, but they harbor about 60% of diversity. So all that to say is, Alabama is a great state to be interested in diversity. Another quick note, so the Alabama SWAP, which is the State Wildlife Action Plan, many of you are probably familiar with this, is all states have this. It's a conservation document that really defines kind of where the funding in the state goes. Individual plant species have no voice right now in this document, and we're not the only state that's like that. So what I'm kind of arguing here in this research is that we need to start funding and seeing plants individually, not just that they're pollinators or that they do certain things, right? We have to start funding them as if they are as important as the animals that we want. Another way to think about this is plants are the scaffolding, right? It's a kind of analogy that I use. So everything else is the building, but plants are the scaffolding. So what I'm going to walk through is some research I have trying to do a series of corridors across the state of Alabama that are plant species focused, right? So we all know what a corridor is. Corridor is essentially a spatial tool that conservationists use usually to gear towards animals, right? We want animals to be able to kind of move through the landscape. So I'm advocating that we use this spatial tool for endangered plant species. So again, we're in Alabama, so we're kind of focused now. So what you're looking at here, so these are the protected areas already in the state. I mentioned Alabama's the lowest in the southeast. The gray is priority areas. So these are what the state's kind of hoping to put into protection. So I've listened to, this has been about 2 years ago, a talk from a NatureServe person that they had done some research that's looked at, are we protecting lands? Are we protecting species on lands that are already protected? Meaning, when we look at plant species, if we just include them in the habitat of the animal, which is what we do, are we actually protecting the species that we need to? And what they found is no. Only 2% of our endangered species are actually on the lands that we're protecting. So I thought that was really interesting. So I went back to my state and I was like, wow, I should look at that. So I pulled a bunch of data, and sure enough, when I look at what's protected and the areas that the state wants to protect, and I overlaid known locations of, this is G1, so the most endangered plant species, there's a mismatch, right? Same thing with G2. So the pink is the G2 species locations. So there's this kind of argument I'm trying to build for how do we use this tool of ecological corridors, but we start with plants instead of a focus on animals. So what I'm going to walk through is a methodology that we're using to generate these corridors and a series of data sets. All right, so the first data set is Moby data. So this came out in, I think, 2020 from NatureServe. So it's essentially a massive data set that looks at all the places in the country that are most at risk for biodiversity loss. So what you're seeing in kind of the bright orange, those are the places at highest risk. And you can see Alabama's kind of on fire, along with parts of California. And the data set, along with that information, it also has predictor models. So you can take a plant species, so again, you're looking at a G1 species, and through algorithms, they've predicted where else in the state might this plant be, or might this plant do well, right? So that's one data set that goes into this kind of corridor design. Another data set is a Southeastern blueprint. So this is a conservation blueprint that covers the Southeast. It essentially takes lands and ranks them by value. Another data set we looked at is the Eastern Wildway. So the Wildlands Network is essentially trying to create corridors and corridors all across the country. So we just focused on the East, obviously, because we're in the East, and overlaid that data set. This data set, again, is geared towards animals. So they've generated their data from where larger animals need to move. We also looked at sleuth models. So sleuth models are predictor models. So in Alabama in the next 75 years, where is it predicted to grow? Where do people want to live? One thing that's really interesting, I think, about this map, that kind of has nothing to do with my research, but Atlanta, anybody from Atlanta? I mean, the predictor models for Atlanta growing is massive. Like, it's already massive. It's going to kind of cross over into Alabama. And this corridor is really interesting from Atlanta, kind of going up to Greenville, and it's going to be just one giant city. But anyway, to back up though, Alabama is actually not predicted to grow near as much as other states. So there is some opportunity there, I think. So you overlay all this data along with a whole bunch of existing data of roads and metropolitan areas and other sorts of information. We divided the state up by the ecoregions. And we are essentially, so this is a group of students I teach at Auburn University. It's a group of graduate landscape architecture students. And along with this research, we're also investigating a new tool for kind of spatial design at a large scale. So normally, I don't know how it looks in all states, but in our state, there's essentially this process of printing out these giant maps, and a whole bunch of wonderful scientists get in a room, and they basically circle areas that they know to be really important, and then that kind of gets given to a GIS person who puts it in GIS. We're using tablet drawing. So essentially, there's a large file with probably 100 different layers of data, and these students are able to turn that data on and off, turn on different layers, priority areas, known areas of endangered species, and essentially draw and redraw. And I'm going to flip through this kind of quickly. But this is a design methodology, right? It's called research by design. And it's erasing, adding layers, adding information, folding their lines back into new drawings. And what they ended up with, this is actually looking at one part of Alabama called the Black Belt. So it's a very particular type of soil. Used to be covered with millions of acres of prairies. It's no longer there. But through this kind of process of refining, adding, erasing, folding drawings back into more drawings, you essentially, we broke the state up and did this with 8 students. So we end up with this kind of large scale corridor, right? This is very schematic at the moment. But what I think is different about this research is that we're starting, see if I can find it. Oops. we're essentially starting from endangered plants, right? It's, the idea is not to ignore the animals or any other species in the state, but the idea that you would generate the design starting from endangered plants is, I think, what's kind of novel about the research. Ooh. Yeah, another thing I'll quickly want to mention is this is not my research, but I think it's really interesting. So this is happening in the Savannah River site. Anybody's familiar with that? It's essentially a team of researchers that have carved out these corridors within the forest. And they are studying, part of what they're studying is plant diversity. And what their early data shows is that if you give plants a corridor, they too will move. They will spread, right? They'll do the same things that the animals do. Another thing I'll quickly mention, that if you're interested in corridors, Florida, at least in the Southeast, Florida is doing amazing things. Everything from how they market what they're doing to how they, dedicate land. Again, their corridor project started from looking at the black bear and the panther. So again, they're very interested in plants as well, but the corridors were initially derived from those two animals. But okay, that's the last slide. So obviously this is very in progress. It would take a lot of partnerships across the state. The last two presentations mentioned DOT. There's no way to do something like this without having DOT on board, especially in the east, because there's not really a lot of land to do this on. So right now I work with several scientists across the state, several different programs that are interested in kind of rehabilitating or restoring endangered species. Yeah, I'll stop there. Thank you. Yeah.
Are there any programs in Alabama for private landowners to be involved in this? Like, I know there's CRP kind of stuff.
Yes, there's several. So the NRCS program is one that we're looking at a lot. So yeah, there is no way to do any type of corridors or connectivity without private land owners. So yes, there's several programs.
To this kind of thing yet?
So this has not been taken to the public yet. It needs a lot more refinement, and we've had a lot of discussions about how you do that, because when you look at this and you're a landowner, you're gonna say, wait a minute, you're crossing my land. So there has to be in place a really robust system of partnerships that make it worthwhile, right? So if people are gonna volunteer their land, it's gotta be worth it financially, worth it in terms of value to them. So this is not public, yeah. Okay. Yes?
Are there any current land protection efforts that are using this in their decision making?
No. I am talking with the current group that's working on the swap. So I'm very interested in the State Wildlife Action Plan. It's an amazingly powerful document in any state. So we are talking through, how do we take the priority areas that the state currently has and make that a little bit more robust in terms of the methodology used to define them. So I'm hoping, so that comes out in 2025, and I'm hoping this research influences some of what goes into that. Yes?
A lot of times the state wildlife action plans ignore tribal priorities as well. So a lot of times there's no communication there. I wondered if in this platform you would work with or plan to work with tribal.
Yes, so there's actually another researcher in my department interested in tribal lands. So yes, I'm very interested in working with that. We don't have a lot of designated tribal lands in Alabama, so it's even more important that makes its way in, but yes, absolutely. Yeah, oh, go ahead.
I'm curious to know if you've met resistance from those who advocate for wildlife funding.
I have not. I will say this largely lives in the plant world right now in Alabama. I don't see there being pushback. I mean, it's not about taking all the funding away. It's just about trying to allocate funding for something that's not, it's not getting a lot of funding at the moment. Yeah, but all that to say is, the day that I get up and we present all this to the animal folks in the state, I hope they're as excited. They're not mad. Yeah.
I really like how you emphasize plant individuals and how they're kind of overlooked. And it's really cool that you have a background in architecture and horticulture. I was interested in the intersection of these two fields, and I've met a lot of landscape architects lately that have started entering the conservation world.
Yes, so a great question, a great thought. These two fields need to come together more, for sure. You know, there's this big movement right now to put A back in STEM, right? Because we've kind of lost the art. So I think landscape architecture is interesting in that it's really both of those things. Large-scale design work is a niche of landscape architecture. It's growing. We have researchers looking at resilient landscapes all along the coast. So I think it's getting there. But I think we're gonna have that, designers have to have a bigger presence in places like this, right? Is anybody here a designer? No. So there needs to be, you know, we need to do more of, you know, landscape architecture is teeny compared to the conservation world, like it's a teeny profession, but we're growing, and I think we need to do a better job of coming to things like this to talk about, because essentially it's a field of designing the land, right? And conservationists and designers could do a lot of things together, I think. Yes, ma'am.
So did you show this? I was wondering how much your plant corridors overlap with the defined wildlife corridors?
So with the existing? So in some places they overlap, in some places I've ignored what was previously done. And that's because, so a lot of that work you see is at a really large scale. So for example, the Eastern Wildway, you know, they're looking at the entire, from Florida all the way up to Maine. So when you take that data and you apply it and scale it down, so it's not gonna be a one-to-one. And for this, when we would start taking cores and diving into actually where these corridors are, it would change again, right? Because there's a scale jump that's happening. Does that make sense?
So I'm wondering, you know, when you talk to the wildlife people, are you going to be able to show that by starting with plants first, you are essentially meeting their needs?
Yes. Yeah, so for example, this data set, let me go back real quick, sorry. This one, right? So this is a completely animal-focused data set that we've included in some of our corridors. So eventually you'd be able to say, well, yes, this isn't only what we're doing, but we've included a lot of that research. So it's not about this instead of that. It's just about kind of giving plants a voice, a strong voice. Because again, I think plants, I might argue, are the kind of foundation. I think I use the framework. You know, they're the scaffolding. Yeah, so I'm just trying to say we need to elevate their voice more in some of the designs that we're doing. Did that answer your question? Sort of?
Yeah, no, it kind of did, but I'm in the wildlife world.
Yeah.
And there's a huge shortage of money. So I don't think that we want to say, we don't want to give money to piping clovers, we want to give money to plants. We want to be able to say there's a way to incorporate all of it.
Sure, absolutely. So some of it's the narrative, absolutely. But again, when we look at the funding, it's 95-5. Like it's not even close. So I do think there's an argument to be made for somewhat evening it out a bit.
There's not enough. So, you know, sort of finding a way to, because those plants are the habitat for the wildlife, there's got to be a way to make that.
And what I'm arguing is that part of the problem is that we only see the plants as habitat for the wildlife. We actually have to see the plants as equal to the wildlife.
This is a great conversation.
No, this is perfect, because this is what's going to happen when I stand up in my state.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Appreciate it.
You're unmuted. So you can just drop it in your pants pocket if you're already on.
Okay. Yes.
So I was trying to keep everyone on. I'll give you a little extra time.
Okay. JF, that's it. Yeah. Yep. Okay. So testing. All right.
All right, thanks everyone. So our next presenter is Johanna Freeman from the Florida Fish and Wildlife Conservation Commission with the Fish and Wildlife Research Institute. She'll be talking about the priority effect and competitive exclusion between seafloor grasses and forbs and restored longleaf pine savannas. Very much.
Thank you. Hi, everyone. Like you said, I'm Johanna Freeman, and I'm a research scientist. I'm the head of terrestrial habitat research at the Fish and Wildlife Research Institute, which is a division of the Florida Fish and Wildlife Conservation Commission. And like the previous speaker said, Florida is actually a great place to do conservation. We have a lot of conservation work going on, both plants and animals. I'm a community ecologist, and plant communities, thinking of things as communities and systems and ecosystems, I see as the way to link plants and animals, following up on that previous conversation, because they include both common and rare things, things that are serving functions and serving as infrastructure. And a lot of the work that I'm going to describe here is looking at system, how we restore things from a systems perspective. Okay, so a little bit of background. Longleaf pine savannas were once the dominant upland throughout the North American coastal plain. They are fire dependent. Prior to European colonization, they're thought to have experienced fire every 1 to 5 years. Now, most of that previous acreage is fire suppressed or disturbed due to agriculture and forestry. There's been a ton of restoration going on in this system for about the past 20, 30 years, especially in Florida, but there's a lot more work to do. These savannas have a lot of similarities, both ecologically and phylogenetically, to the tallgrass prairies of the Great Plains. There's a lot of differences too, but as far as the literature on the plant communities, I've drawn a lot from their literature because they have a much longer period of experience with doing the kind of restoration I'm going to describe. And there is very high biodiversity on old growth longleaf pine savannas. It's a really broad category. They go from wet to extremely xeric, and but they all have these dominant species, longleaf pines and wiregrass. So when we're trying to understand what makes plant communities tick, it is helpful to break things down into guilds or functional groups. And I'm going to talk about a system of functional groups today that includes C4 graminoids. These are graminoids that use C4 photosynthesis, which is an adaptation to heat and drought. Forbs, that is herbaceous flowering plants. Shrubs, woody flowering plants. Legumes, members of the Fabaceae family. And C3 graminoids, or cool season grasses, which use C3 photosynthesis. There are a lot of reasons why functional diversity is important in grasslands and savannas. And to start understanding why, we can start below ground. C3 grasses have their greatest nutrient uptake in spring and fall, and they have a high root length density. C4 grasses have their greatest nutrient uptake in summer, and they have a very high root length density. Forbs have very deep roots, and they get even deeper in the presence of grasses. And legumes, members of the Fabaceae family, have nitrogen-fixing symbiotic bacteria in their roots. All of these things have implications for ecosystem functioning and sustainability. What we get with all of these different functional groups exploiting different parts of the soil profile is complementarity. So they are, over evolutionary time, things evolve to fill different niches, and they complement each other in terms of exploiting the resources of the ecosystem. And there is a strong diversity productivity relationship. There have been a bunch of great studies showing that the more diversity you have within functional groups and between functional groups, the more productivity you get. So that is a measure of how well this entire system is making use of the available resources. Now, if we go above ground, we start looking into wildlife habitat, C3 grasses have seeds that are important wildlife foods, as do C4 grasses. C4 grasses also in longleaf pine savannas are form the basis of the fine fuel structure that carries frequent fires. And that's what maintains that grassland and savanna structure that harbors this tremendous plant diversity and also animal diversity. Forbs that's all of our wildflowers, or a lot of our wildflowers. They are pollinator resources, and they also have seeds and fruits for wildlife. And then legumes. In this study, I'm mostly going to lump forbs and legumes, but they also are pollinator resources and wildlife foods. And there too, diversity is important, and also seasonality. So having wildlife habitat provisioning throughout the year is a facet of these ecosystems that we want to restore. The same goes for pollinator resources. Having things blooming in all different seasons of the year is an important aspect of this. And all of these things have implications for ecosystem resilience. Functional diversity and functional redundancy are both thought to influence ecosystem resilience. If you have more members of a functional group and you lose some, there will be more left to continue serving that function in the ecosystem. Okay, so we know all these things are important, so let's just go out and plant them, right? Well, that's kind of what we've been doing for about the past 20 years, but there is a problem with that sometimes, and it has to do with C4 grasses, which are, they're basically the backbone of this ecosystem, and a lot of our restoration focuses on restoring that grassland structure. But C4 grasses have life history traits and physiological characteristics that confer competitive advantages on restored sites. That makes them very easy to restore relative to other groups. They have wind-dispersed seeds, high seed viability, rapid germination, high growth rates, and relatively large peak biomass, at least relative to forbs. What that can lead to is something called competitive exclusion, whereby one species or functional group has competitive advantages that prevent others from establishing. And another facet of that is priority effects, where the first species to establish on a site gain a competitive advantage over those arriving subsequently. Both of these phenomena are very well documented in C4 grasses on restored sites in other regions. A lot of work has been done in the tallgrass prairie region, also in California and in Europe. And we do a lot of the same kind of restoration in Florida and in longleaf pine systems of the Southeast. But these things have not been studied in longleaf pine savannas, at least not in severely altered sites that are being restored. Where it has been studied in old growth sites, there's actually been no evidence of competitive exclusion by C4 grasses. I think there's a couple reasons for that. It's a pretty different situation than these severely altered sites I'm going to be talking about. So this study is focused on restoring former pastures, which is a type of land that the Florida Fish and Wildlife Conservation Commission has a lot of. We've had acquired and had donated a lot of former ranches and things like that that have like amazing old growth ecosystems on them. And then they also have a lot of former pasture. And this is true for a lot of other agencies in Florida as well. Florida pastures are almost always consisting of bahia grass, Paspalum notatum, which is an exotic sod-forming grass. It forms a near monoculture. And what you usually have is this basically monoculture of Paspalum notatum, but then with some little pasture weeds here and there, almost no remnant plant community, a remnant native plant community. So when we restore these, what we do is total removal of the pasture sod with herbicide. Usually takes 3 minutes. No way. Okay. Okay, so we do this restoration, and what we're going for is to restore the entire system. This has historically focused on wiregrass. This is the an old growth specialist. It's kind of the keystone in the old growth systems, but there are a lot of other co-occurring important species. We've got blue stems, Andropogon and Schizochirium. We got Eragrostis, Sorgastrum, and Spirobolus. So we designed a study to look at all of those. And we had 3 hypotheses. The order in which functional groups arrive will drive their ultimate relative abundances in the community. Different C4 grass species will have different competitive interactions. And planted C4 grasses will suppress volunteer C4 grasses due to within-group competitive exclusion. We had 3 different sites, and on each one we installed a 30 by 20 meter wildlife exclosure, and we did 6 different treatments in it. Within those, we sampled little 1/4 meter quads after we planted in 2 subsequent years, and then we sampled 1 growing season after the second planting event. And we had transects inside of them, and we sampled 1/4 meter quads to look at the whole plant community in there. And that's what that looked like, a couple herbicide treatments, a fire, and then we introduced the seed. What our treatments were was forbs and grasses together in both years. Treatment 2 was grasses first and forbs second. The 3rd treatment was forbs first and grasses second. Then our 4th treatment was grasses alone in both years. 5th treatment was forbs alone in both years. And then our 6th treatment was unplanted. We had 4 replicates of each treatment at each site with a total of 12 replicates per treatment. We had 8 forb species. We ended up lumping non-leguminous and leguminous forbs for this research. And we had 5 C4 grass species. So what we found here, the green bars are total grass cover, and that is of all species summed together. The shaded part at the bottom is the planted grass species, and the open part at the top is volunteers. So the green is grasses, the blue is forbs. What we found was that if there were C4 grasses in the year 1 mix, we ended up with this really grass-dominated community. All of those treatments had significantly higher C4 grass cover than the other treatments and significantly lower forb cover. And the opposite was true. Looking at the unplanted treatment there is important too. This really tells us that we did have strong competitive exclusion and strong priority effects of C4 grasses. And it didn't matter if there were also forbs in there in the first year, and it didn't matter if forbs came in the second year. Also, though, we did see priority effects of forbs, and when they got grasses in the second year, that also had no effect on the community. So looking at our volunteers, this is just volunteer species. These are our 3 treatments that got C4 grasses in the first year. Those had a lot less volunteer cover than the others, and we found that C4 grasses were suppressing across functional groups. They suppressed volunteers. And then looking at our whole plant community, you can see that this is the summed percent cover for all species from these functional groups. We have C3 graminoids and woody in here too. That was all volunteer. So the total amount of plant cover is the same. So that's probably some kind of just an ecological limit out there of a growing space. But you can see that the 3 treatments that had C4 grasses in the first year had a much larger grass component. And I don't have reference sites in this presentation, but I've done research comparing reference sites to restored sites, and I can just tell you that this one is of more similar proportions to what you see on old growth sites. All right, so just quickly, this is an NMDS ordination plot. Each point is a transect, and they're colored by site and by treatment. That the darker gray oval, that is all the treatments that contain C4 grasses in the first year. The light gray oval is all the treatments that did not contain them, and you can see a big separation there. So we got grass-dominated and forb-dominated communities depending on whether the grasses came in the first year. There's also a big difference in community between sites. And at our Caravel Ranch, that was one of our 3 sites, those were Aristida and Andropogon dominated. And then At our Hyloche site, they were Eragrostis dominated, and that co-occurred with Paspalum notatum and Eupatorium, weedy Eupatoriums. Not totally sure what the cause and effect was there, but I do know that the unplanted treatments at those sites had a much higher levels of the weeds. So I think there might have been higher background levels of weeds, and it's possible that Eragrostis was a stronger competitor with the weedy species. All right. So we found strong evidence for priority effects and competitive exclusion. And we found that planted grasses did suppress volunteers. However, there was a very large volunteer component alongside the planted grasses. And so we got a much grassier community when we planted C4 grasses. Eragrostis may be more tolerant of weedy competition than the others. So it may be something to consider including that in planting mixes to buffer against planting failure. And we might want to think about planting at least a portion of restoration sites with forb-only seed mixes, perhaps in strips or patches alongside grasses. All right.
Time for one question?
Yeah.
Seeding rates for forbs versus like grasses.
I do not have that with me. I was afraid someone was going to ask me that after, yeah.
So you talk a lot about comparing your data to what the old growth would look like. What are your thoughts on, is there other ways to decide whether what you've created is good or bad without saying, because there's a lot of kind of discourse in conservation right now that talks about like you can't return it to the thing it was before. So how do we get
Yes.
what it is now?
Yeah, this is me doing that because I'm trying to look at functions and functional diversity. So yes, exactly. It's, with the old growth stuff, it's hard to get away from that entirely because often you have to get to something empirical if you're going to say what's good, what's bad. And it can be a little tricky to do that. But yes, this is me trying to get to a way of measuring what we want out of these systems in, their functional diversity.
Yes. I know you did. I don't think you're at the top. It should be right at the top. Let's start. No, hit start. Stop.
That's storing goes. And this is your drive right here. Is that your drive? Perfect. Thank you. Okay. Yes, sir.
Anywhere up here?
You might want to move your land, it'll shake back.
I see.
Can you raise it just a little bit?
Sure. Good.
Go ahead. Test this.
Test, test. Test, 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 test.
Goodbye, Ed or Edward?
Ed.
All right, here we go. All right, everyone, we're at our last presenter for this session. It's Ed Toth from the Mid-Atlantic Regional Seed Bank, and he's going to be talking about regional seed bank organization.
Thank you. Good morning, everyone. I'm presenting on a meeting that was held yesterday morning, 9 o'clock, first day, to organize an association of seed banks focused on meeting the need for restoration seed. So this is an idea that's been rattling around in my head for quite a while, and took advantage of the seed conference to call a meeting. First off, hello. The bottom one advances forward. Counterintuitive. I'd like to thank the planning committee. We were meeting pretty much since the first of the year to iron this all out. Several are here in the room. If you want to just raise your hands. Worked really hard. All very busy people with a lot of responsibilities. Took the time out over the last 3 months to organize this session and to think through what our reasons for doing it and what might all entail. We had amazing response, both in person and remote, so we ran a hybrid meeting yesterday. Thanks to everybody on the committee who made that happen. In analyzing the response, we had seed bank representatives from 16 states, everywhere from Hawaii to Boston, from the Northwest to Florida, and parts in between, 38 institutions, 65 individuals came together to discuss this. So I like to think that the moment was indeed ripe for this discussion and to start talking about how we might work together. This is a very familiar diagram, I think, for most of you, of native plant material supply chain, all the components that are necessary to do this. I've been involved in native plant material production and development for my entire career, for almost 40 years in one way or another. I can tell you that, there are successes and failures in all this. There are pieces of the supply chain that exist, but there are gaps. There's also great complexity to this supply chain, feedback loops, tremendous interdependencies of one part of the supply chain on the others. But fundamentally, at the root of this supply chain is the need for a sustained supply of wild seed. So all the work that you're hearing about throughout this conference, doing restoration and remediation work, is all dependent on plant materials to do that work. And at the root of that plant material production is the need for a supply of wild seed. And that's what we gather together to talk about. If you look at that history of native plant material development, it's obvious that there is great need, and there has been for a long time, and that need is still there and growing. Federally, a lot of that, since almost the year 2000, the federal agencies have had a mandate to meet their need for seed for fire suppression. If you look at that history of the attempt of the federal agencies to meet that need, basically the supply chain is not there even 25 years later in any holistic way. So there have been successes along the way. Non-federal level, certainly a lot of substantial individual efforts regionally, locally, a lot of very passionate people involved in doing this. One of the things, if you look at the successes over that period, is that if you look at the things that really characterize those successes, it's large groups of people working together cooperatively to make this happen. And by and large, those successes have been regionally based or locally based, but certainly not one size fit all sort of national effort. So I find myself increasingly asking myself these days, are we at a really critical moment in this effort at native plant material supply? Again, tremendous need. It's only growing. We've had efforts like in 2015, the publication of a national seed strategy, a really comprehensive blueprint for how we might go about seeing that the supply of native plant material was going to make its way to meet everyone's needs. Just in January, a study of the National Academy of Sciences was published that looked extensively over a 3-year period into particularly the needs of the federal agencies, but also all levels and all across the United States for native plant materials, and made very concrete recommendations about what it would take to have a really sustainable supply chain of native plant material. And we see, as one of the speakers this morning emphasized, that we all of a sudden we have this influx of really significant federal funding, certainly significant compared to what it's been in the past. So are we at a moment of opportunity, at least, if not outright change? And if we are, we face a conundrum when it comes to that wild seed. As we know that the need is there and the need is growing, but as you all start to succeed in your work, witness the DOT programs in the Northwest, the supply of native plant materials is only going to increase. And if that supply is to increase, then the need for and the pressure on wild seed collected from functional wild ecosystems is only going to increase. So we face this conundrum where if we succeed at what we all want to succeed at, is there going to be a supply of wild seed to fuel this entire endeavor? And will those sources be adequately protected, adequately managed, harvested, utilized, but sustainable? So we're really at a critical moment, I believe. And so really great in my view that obvious that 50 or 60 individuals from over 35 institutions, I think, share that opinion that this is the moment in time to come together and start discussing this. So we came up, the committee in advance came up with some guiding principles that we put forth to the group yesterday. These are all things that are going to get tweaked yet now that we've had input from the larger group. But in general, these are the guiding principles that we think we see ourselves operating under. First of all, a conservation first statement that above all, conservation of native ecosystems are of primary importance to take precedent over any activities that we may undertake to harvest seed from those populations. Without the continued health and sustainability of those wild ecosystems, we cannot possibly think about meeting the need for wild seed to fuel the whole process. At the root of that, and I've been thinking about this for a long time and advocating for this, we need to start thinking of wild seed as a natural resource and a critical natural resource. Much of the harvesting and use of native seed, wild seed through today and continuing is a very haphazard approach. Everyone out there doing for themselves, no really systematic monitoring and understanding of who's harvesting. Some harvesting is done commercially, and that can be fine, but there's no coordination and use of this natural resource. So it's really kind of wide open, and we really don't even know at times when we're overexploiting these resources. But we understand that this wild resource needs active and expert management, and that's one of the reasons for us to come together and start to think about how to make that a reality. We need to make sure that we're protecting the genetic diversity of that wild resource, both in, again, protecting the systems, but also how we use that collection, make that collection, and put it into production. And at the root of it all, and the reason we're doing this is that in addition to all that, we understand that wild seed is absolutely critical for the native plant material supply chain. So we need to protect it, we need to manage it, but we also then have an obligation to see that there is an adequate supply so that all of you can do the wonderful work that you're doing. And again, this mission statement will get tweaked a bit as well. But in essence, we agreed that we will be an association for now, that the members will promote, develop, and collectively manage the mission of the association to assist its member institutions through its policies, programs, and committees, to both better function where we live and work as individual institutions. We'll do that to meet the needs for wild seed and to see that that seed is widely available for development but under a set of commonly shared guidelines and principles going forward. So we held a 4-hour meeting. I've got 3 minutes left. We went through introductions. I went over some of the things I just covered. One of the things that was completely clear was that we are a diverse group of seed banks. Many of us are focused on banking and rare and endangered species. That's, come from a botanic garden background. Others are not. Others are just starting to get into this, moving into it from other areas of working in the supply chain. For now, we have agreed that we will have a charter for the association. We may eventually move into a memorandum of understanding for reasons having to do with funding and things like that. We went through a discussion of the mission statement and the guiding principles that I just showed you. Then we had 2 whiteboarding sessions that were really fantastic and really revealed a lot. First of all, we just asked everybody, both who joined us remotely or in person, to tell us about what their organization engages in, and it was amazing. The really startling thing for me that came forward was just how many strengths already exist among those body of people. And so what the most obvious thing is that we need to start sharing the knowledge that we all contain individually, our strengths, with the other members, help each other. We talked about the possibility of a starter package because there was certainly a large subgroup of individuals, institutions that were just starting to get into this, and we could really help those groups with our collective experience. And then we did a second whiteboarding session to look at what was most important to focus on. And again, lots of suggestions that we need to whittle down through time. Again, I would say the thing that came up over and over again was that there is all this existing knowledge already out there and that we need to share that widely between the members of the association. And almost certainly we will form working groups going forward. That will be the main way in which we operate. And again, there was a lot of discussion of what those potential working groups could be. Just as an example, we could have a working group focused on best management practices or standards for operating a restoration seed bank. Overwhelmingly, we need to be getting the seed out. Many seed banks, there was Kay Havens, who was part of our committee, cited a study that showed that the vast majority of holdings in existing seed banks, especially botanic garden seed banks, stays in the seed bank and is not getting out. And with our focus on meeting restoration needs, clearly what we need to do is be getting that seed out to all of you to do your work. It does mean we need to do it under a set of guidelines and in which we're going to let that seed make it available. So the next step, the planning committee will synthesize everything we learned yesterday. We're hoping to do that by the end of this month, or end of April, not the end of this month. And then present all that back to the participants. Participants will have a month to chew this all over and solicitate membership from all those who participated, sign a charter document, hopefully, and start to form these working groups. So in essence, why an association? As I said yesterday, this is not a promise that you will have less work to do by forming an association. You will have more work to do, but the promise of doing this is that we will work smarter, we'll work more effectively, we will certainly be there to aid each other, and hopefully, above all, that we will begin to meet the need to fuel the entire supply chain. If we missed anybody, did not reach out to you, apologies, first of all. Secondly, totally feel free reach out and to join us. For now, unfortunately, that means my email address. Hopefully that will change, but feel free to reach out to me and join us. So this is just by way of saying we're here, and we have great hopes for serving all of you in a meaningful way into the future. Thank you. Was I that good? Yes.
I'm curious, what about folks who have existing sets of collections that are older, may not have met the standards that the group develops, but are potentially an excellent resource to include? What would you think about that? Like maybe somebody's sitting on a freezer with 3,000 collections that were made over
Yeah.
30 years.
Well, of course, it's when you're talking about native plant material development, it's very relative as to the viability of that seed that you still have. So certainly testing of that seed would be really critical if the intent is to get it, again, out in some useful. Certainly I could see, hopefully, again, we're just starting up, but that we could assist with placing that seed within the areas that we work. And lastly, I think, oh, now I lost my last point. But, you know, I think we could find ways to do that. Oh, my other point is that, you know, if you accept, and I don't see, I think most people in this room would, the SER continuum along the restoration spectrum, that if it's not appropriate for restoration, it may be appropriate for rehabilitation, it may be appropriate for horticulture. So again, if we keep an open mind about that, I mean, I don't know what the species are, obviously, but you know, I think that's right up the alley of what our membership could help with, hopefully, going down the road. Thanks again.